The focus of this presentation is religious beauty, especially in churches. Let us look at some large, beautiful Catholic churches, both in the U.S., but especially in Europe. The large, gorgeous churches are not ones that most people visit regularly on Sundays for Mass. Rather, when they are on vacation or traveling, they go out of their way to visit such churches. Or because it's a major feast such as Easter, Pentecost, or Christmas, people in the somewhat nearby area, perhaps many miles away, make a point to visit a particularly large and popular church or cathedral. I will first point out some features of these large churches, but the main point of this presentation is primarily to enjoy their beauty and be in awe of the various people in the churches who get to see them, but also the people who designed the churches, actually built them, or simply worshipped in them over the centuries. Many large churches, especially cathedrals, were built in the Gothic style in the 13th century and later. These Gothic cathedrals have very tall ceilings, usually with very thin walls, and with windows usually at 3 different levels. Windows are the main source of light, so there are windows at the main level of the pews, and especially these stained glass windows can be seen by all rather easily, and therefore they often depict scenes from the Gospel or from the Old Testament. In many cathedrals, above the ground windows, there is a gallery where people can actually gather upstairs and look out onto the nave of the church. That is called the triforium. Above the triforium is an area called the clerestory. And if there is no triforium, then the clerestory is right above the ground windows. And it's called the clerestory because it lets in light that fills in the main nave of the church and illumines it. And it highlights all the different parts of the church. Sometimes the clerestory is so high that they don't use stained glass windows, just clear windows, and other times they do use stained glass windows, though it's more difficult to make out the figures in the window. And above that second of the clerestory is this third level, and many of them often are clear, both to let in the light, but also because they're really too far away for the observer to be able to appreciate any intricate patterns in the stained glass windows. In any church, there is always a main center aisle. And that aisle, with the pews on each side, is called the nave of the church. It's the main central axis of the church. In a large church, there often is a horizontal aisle, which is kept clear. It's a route for the parishioners to get to the main aisle, and that's called the transept. In a large church, like a cathedral, there is often a dome centered right above the intersection of the horizontal aisle, which is the transept, and the main nave of the church, the main axis, the main aisle. A large church often has an area at the top of the aisle, so like the front of the what appears to be a provisional front of the church, but then there are a few steps going up and leading into a more narrow area. In this area, the pews are not facing toward the front as they are in the main body of the church, the nave, but they're facing towards one another. In fact, most of them are not really pews, but individual seats. And this area is called the choir. At the very front of the choir is, at least in Catholic cathedrals, the high altar. Then behind the high altar, but often not accessible from the high altar, is a very large chapel, very ornately decorated. And invariably it's called Our Lady's Chapel, and it's dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary. In some Protestant churches, the choir is where the choir actually sings. If you watched the funeral of Queen Elizabeth, it took place in Westminster Abbey. By the way, Westminster Abbey used to be a Catholic cathedral, but that all changed in the 16th century when King Henry VIII declared himself the head of the Catholic Church in England. That was the beginning of events that led to Westminster being an Anglican cathedral. In any event, in the Catholic cathedral, the seats were facing one another because that is where the monks gathered to recite daily the divine office. And in the divine office, there are many psalms which are chanted by the monks. For any psalm, the custom was and is, the monks on one side of the choir chant one verse of the psalm, and then the next verse is chanted by the monks on the opposite side of the choir area. And so it goes back and forth like that until they get to the end of the psalm. And then if they begin a new psalm, it's the same routine that happens. There's one side that chants a verse, and then the other side chants it. Cathedrals are built on a large scale with beautiful windows, pews, statues, appointments, sacred vessels, and fine liturgical garments. All this is not to impress God. Rather, all these things are fabricated to show, first, that human beings are willing to dedicate much time and abundant talent and resources to reflect the fact that they are made in the image and likeness of God, that they have the capability of designing and building these very beautiful things. Second, humans understand that beauty often raises the minds and hearts of Christian believers to God Himself, the source of all beauty. That is, beauty in church architecture and in its interior reinforces in human beings the conviction that God surpasses beauty even of the most attractive and appealing type. So God is the source of all beauty and exceeds all human beauty. If we look at a particular cathedral-like structure of St. Clotilde, we can see some features of the cathedral. So the Basilica of St. Clotilde in Paris is built like a cathedral, but it's technically a basilica. And it was built in the 19th century, and it's in the Gothic style, so they call that neo-Gothic. It's located actually only a few blocks away from the Eiffel Tower in the 15th arrondissement of Paris. The nave for St. Clotilde is quite narrow, but the tall windows on both the ground level and the second level can be clearly seen, and they depict various saints, including St. Clotilde, who was the second wife of King Clovis and who lived from 474 to 545 AD. There is beautiful definition in the many columns. For example, instead of a single massive column, the columns are articulated so it appears as if for any single column there are 8 or 10 columns combining to give the cathedral strength and solidity. All this we find very pleasing to the eye, and for this reason people want to be in such churches. There are many beautiful cathedrals also in the United States. Perhaps the best known is St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, but St. Louis also has 2 beautiful cathedrals, as does Minneapolis St. Paul. And there is also the National Catholic Cathedral in Washington, D.C. All these give witness to the beauty that is in men and women and is patterned or is sourced in God's beauty. These are things for our admiration, but also to lift our minds and hearts to God.